My name is L.J. Stambuk. I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council. What a treat we have today. We had the privilege of having a dinner with Meredith and George Friedman last night, and we learned so much.
It truly is an honor and a privilege to introduce to you today Dr. George Friedman, a prodigious intellect and a renowned strategic thinker. Actually, Dr. Friedman's visit represents the epitome of what the World Affairs Council has set out to do in our community, which is to be a catalyst for global thinking. And frankly, there is no better accelerant than George Friedman. Dr. Friedman comes to us not only with great portfolio, but with deep and thoughtful perspective. With respect to portfolio, many of you are familiar with George and his credentials, which are long and impressive. He's the founder and driving force behind Stratfor, a leading consulting firm in the field of global intelligence, which Meredith is also a partner in. And he's an accomplished teacher and prolific author and speaker with books like The Next 100 Years, America's Secret War, The Future of War. And he's also a person on whose opinion rides some very important global decisions being made by many household name companies. So, but lots of people come here with portfolio. It's Dr. Friedman's unique perspective that really makes him special. He's a complex thinker who drives toward reason and rationale by challenging not only the assumptions of the people around him, but his own on a regular basis. In his new book, Flashpoints, which will be, by the way, available afterwards, he'll be staying after and signing books and talking with you about it if you'd like. George shares with us in that book the genesis of that perspective that he has, some of which I'm sure he'll share with us today. I must say, and I don't say this about all of our speakers, and very few of them actually, I mean, this is a remarkable book that he's written. It weaves together parts of George's personal history along with insightful analysis of the European experience in the 31-year period between 1914 and 1945, which, as we all know, was a truly horrendous and tragic period for Europe. And it still shapes, influences, and touches us even today. So a final couple of observations about perspective before we get George up here. George grew up in a tough neighborhood in the Bronx, which should provide all of the perspective one might need in life. It's a pretty good upbringing. But there's much, much more to George, some of which he relates in his book, which is why I think this book is extraordinary. Perspective doesn't come easy. As I was reading George's book, I realized that he and I were born in the same year, 1949. George was born in the dead of winter of 1949. I was born in the fall. I was happily playing in my bassinet in Cleveland, Ohio, with my adoring parents, hoping that I might amount to something in life sometime and have a comfortable life, all of which I'm still working on. George's world was very different. George was born in Hungary to a very tough, complicated, and resilient Jewish parents who somehow managed to survive World War II while living with the indelible pain and sorrow of having lost other family members in places like Auschwitz. As noted in his book, Flashpoints, Hungary, as occupied by the Soviets after the war, was just as treacherous and dangerous a place for families like George's as it was during the war. As George relates in his book, his parents were faced with an impossible choice. Either, number one, they stayed in Hungary and faced what appeared to be never-ending catastrophic situation, or two, they could try to escape and perhaps die with their children in the attempt. For George's parents, there really was no choice. So in that year of 1949, while I was safely ensconced in my bassinet in Cleveland, George, at 6 months of age, was in a rubber raft with his parents, with his 11-year-old sister, at night on the Hungarian shore of the Danube River, ready to paddle to freedom. an enormous risk. George was only 6 months old, of course, and when he was sitting in the raft, and he couldn't admit it at the time, but he does in his book, that actually he was the main threat to the whole escape operation. As he describes it, a crying baby in the silence of the night would mean certain death. That, my friends, brings perspective. You know, since I've dated George and me by discussing our birth dates, I referenced kind of in closing the contemporary philosopher of that era, the great contemporary philosopher of the era, Paul Harvey, in commending to you, I hope there's some people that remember Paul Harvey, in commending to you George's book for, as Paul would say, the rest of the story. I'm not going to tell it all to you tonight. Believe me, it's a spellbinding tale. You're unlikely to get a lot of details about it from George here at the podium, but there's plenty for you to read in his book. So with that, if you would, please join me in welcoming to Charlotte and to the podium a man of great perspective, George Friedman.
Thank you for that extraordinary introduction and stealing the first 10 minutes of my talk. I'm delighted to be in Charlotte again. I've spent a great deal of time in Charlotte. Never left the airport, but I'm sure the rest of the town is very nice. I wrote the book Flashpoints for two reasons. The first, I wanted to come to grips with an extraordinary reality of Europe. Europe invented the world. And when I say that, I mean this. Before the European age of exploration, the Mongols had no idea about the Zulus. The Zulus didn't know the Aztecs existed. The Aztecs had no idea about the Brits. We lived on a single planet, but our definition of the world was infinitely smaller. And this was the case from the beginning of humanity. When you take a look at Ptolemy's maps of the world, you wouldn't recognize them. But they were his maps of his world, and there were fragments. What Europe did, starting in the middle of the 15th century, was rip the veil off the world. And doing so, they invented humanity. Our definition of humanity was me, my brother, and I'm not sure about his friend. It was the village, the town, the clan, the place you live. The discovery of a universal humanity throughout the world that may not like each other or understand each other, nevertheless share a common humanity of sorts, was a European achievement. It's a story in itself, not to be told here, of why Europe did this. Why not the Romans? Why not the Chinese? Why then? We could go through that, and we should, but for now, let's leave it at the simple fact. They did. In creating humanity, they didn't simply create a map of the world, but they had an evolution of thought that spoke about a concept called the rights of man. It was called the French Enlightenment. And just as the explorers revolutionized their understanding of the world, the Enlightenment transformed the meaning of living in that world. And in the writings of Rousseau, in the writings of Montesquieu, or whoever, it was a necessary next step to exploring the world. It was exploring its meaning. And they delivered us an idea of humanity that hadn't existed before. And they went further, and they invented the idea of the nation state. The idea that not only is the individual part of humanity and that he has certain rights, but he's part of a community that speaks a language, has a shared history, and has what I call a love of one's own. The most natural form of love is love of one's own. A baby at the age of 2 does not wonder about the meaning of love or whether there are better mothers in the world. Probably. He accepts that love, and that's his obligations. And the Ten Commandments, which speaks about honor thy father and thy mother, that is not about sending Christmas cards. It is rather, their beliefs are my beliefs, their enemies are my enemies, their friends are my friends. That's what honor thy father and thy mother mean. And here we begin coming into the problem. If we believe in the right of national self-determination, we must also believe that there are differences between people. That is, a Hungarian is not an Austrian is not an Italian, and that there are differences. So we come back struggling to define humanity, drawing the great differences between people at the same time. Europe conquered the world. It also transformed nature. It was possible in 1900 to travel 30 miles in an evening on a train to attend a concert in which the winter was banished, so was night, and Mozart was being played. Europe can be forgiven much for Mozart. It was a magnificent culture. Like all cultures, a contradictory culture. But then something happened, something of enormous importance. From 1914 to 1945, in 31 years, Europe engaged in the most savage bloodbath in human history. 100 million Europeans died of political causes between 1914 and 1945. In the First World War, in the Second World War, in the planned starvations by Stalin in the Ukraine, in the Spanish Civil War, and on and on. In a continent that never had more than 500 million inhabitants, 100 million died. Not only 100 million died, but Europe lost its sovereignty. It went from dominating the world, British Empire, French Empire, a Belgian Empire, for God's sakes. From each European state having an empire and ruling virtually or influencing or being involved deeply in every part of the world, at some point, it went to occupied territory. The Soviets occupied it, and the Americans occupied it. And they lost their empire. The story of Europe is extraordinary, firstly in what they built, and secondly in what they lost, and how quickly they lost it. The question is, how could this happen? In 1913 and in 1910, a man called Norman Angell, a Nobel Prize winner later and a very brilliant man, wrote a book demonstrating mathematically that it was impossible for there to be another war in Europe. His argument was very simple. Europe is too interdependent. And because of the financial interdependence, the trade interdependence, a war would be so devastating it couldn't be held. And he was right. Assuming the assumption that the primary purpose of people is to make money, he nailed it. But clearly, that was not the primary purpose, or not the purpose by itself. Because the assumption that you cannot have conflict if you have interdependence proved not to be the case, which makes a great deal of sense if you think about it. Brazil and Madagascar are not going to have a war. They don't touch each other, they don't affect each other. Wars break out between countries that are interdependent, because if you are interdependent, that means you're dependent, and you're going to try to manage that dependence, making sure that the other guy doesn't do something that hurts you. And he's going to do that as well. And so when you have interdependence, this is the foundation of conflict. Norman Angel's theory was interesting because it's a very common one now. It is the belief that all human beings pursue economic ends and that those economic ends control what we do. If there was ever anything to prove that wrong, it was World War I. It made no economic sense, and neither was it irrational. The dilemma of Europe was always the same. What was the dilemma? It is the second smallest continent in the world. The only smaller continent is Australia. My wife's Australian, so I will say what I always say. Australia is not a continent. It's a very big island with very little inside the country except desert, so let's not confuse this. Europe is the smallest real continent. It has 52 sovereign states, national self-determination. They speak different languages, they have different histories, and most of their histories designate others as their enemies. My mother could not say the word Romanian without spitting. Years after she had left the country, I mean, that was just, if you're Romanian, you're an enemy. She was Hungarian. So, the third question that really has to be answered here is, it ended in 1945. Is it over? The Europeans have been patting themselves on the back ever since 1992 for what a tremendous job they've done. You talk about American exceptionalism. The European position is, we went through World War II and it's really hit us. Genocide is a bad idea. Don't do it. If history were only that simple, if life were only that simple. So the question here is it over? Is the 31 years merely the first chapter in a much longer story, or the last chapter in a very long story that continues? Or is it really a breakpoint in European history? And this matters tremendously because Europe is the richest economic zone in the world. The collective GDP of Europe is larger than the collective GDP of the United States. It may have no global powers, but it has certainly significance. What happens in Europe matters to the world. And that was one of the reasons I wrote the book. The second reason was alluded to. Unlike any of my other books that were kind of impersonal, this was about my life, or if not my life, my parents' life. We speak of geopolitics, and it's a very impersonal thing. Okay, this country making war with that country. For me, my entire life was shaped by geopolitical realities. My parents were born in the old Habsburg Empire. My mother in the city of Bratislava. My father east in the Carpathian Mountains in a town called Uzhgorod. Don't worry about where it is. Their fathers fought in the First World War against the Turks, so they're brothers. They died. They came home broken. They came home to whatever was left. The borders of Europe changed. My mother moved to from Bratislava to Budapest. My father moved from what was Ukraine to Budapest, now Ukraine. Because after all, if one is Hungarian, one lives with Hungarians, not with Slovaks. And that was understood in Europe. And they met, and they fell in love, and they married, and he started a printing business. And it looked like they were going to have a life. And they had a little girl, and everything was well. But the German question was not settled. Versailles guaranteed that the Germans would repose the issue of German requirements. And in 1932, the Germans were both liberal and pathetically weak. In 1938, 6 years later, they were the greatest military force on the continent, which reminds me always that don't write anybody off. This began changing their lives because Germany started redefining Europe. And in redefining Europe, it redefined Hungarian strategy. With the Germans there, the Hungarians had to make their peace with the Germans. And making the peace with the Germans meant joining them in their military adventures. Joining them in the military adventures meant joining them in invading the Soviet Union. Invading the Soviet Union meant my father was in a uniform in a Hungarian battalion and sent to the front. And he marched with the Hungarian army to the city of Voronezh, north of Stalingrad. This is where the Russians staged their great counterattack, right on Voronezh. Why? At Voronezh were the Hungarians, Romanians, and the Italians. In Stalingrad were the Germans. Where do you go and attack? You had the Romanians, the Italians, and the Hungarians. And who was the most exposed? The Jews. They were most exposed because they were in labor battalions, and unlike all soldiers who were expected to be willing to die, the Jews were expected to die. That was what they were there for. And they attacked over the Hungarian army. They broke the Hungarian army. The Hungarian army had no great desire to build the Third Reich, so it fell apart. And my father walked home from Voronezh to Budapest, about 1,000 miles, in the winter of 42, 43. Of his battalion of about 500 men, 5 survived. I asked my father, what he did. His first answer was, he had a daughter and my sister, and he would imagine my sister was sitting there and he had to go pick her up. And he would spend days going to get to where my sister was sitting. His second answer was, I'm a country boy. And the city boys just didn't have it. They couldn't survive. And then he would say, I was lucky. Sheer dumb luck. On the one hand, I deal with geopolitics as something you can predict. And yet, at the lowest level, the smallest level, where we actually live, our individual lives, it is strictly a question of pure dumb luck. But he survived. And he came back, and the Germans were not occupying Hungary, so he went back to make a living. And then the Germans came in. And he was taken to Mauthausen, the concentration camp. My mother went to one. My sister, at the age of 5, was hidden in the basement of a Swiss guaranteed building, and she had to survive. My mother, my father, my sister survived the war. That's extraordinary in the family, that all 3 would survive. Many others died. They survived. And like the spider in the drain spout, my father started rebuilding his printing plant. And this time, the Soviets, who had beaten the Wehrmacht, now occupied Hungary. And it was discovered that my father had been in the labor battalion. It had been a social democrat before the war. The communists hated the social democrats because they challenged them for the working class, and they didn't want that. My father personally had no politics at this point. His view was geopolitics basically was deadly, and politics simply tied my hands. He had very few beliefs in anything transcendental. Nevertheless, he was on a list. And to be on a list in Hungary in 1949 meant death. He found out he was on a list because my uncle was a lifelong communist and a member of the secret police. My father and my uncle hadn't spoken for 30 years, partly over deep disagreements of the meaning of Hegel and the early Marx, and partly over somebody doing something to someone at a bar mitzvah. It's a family. So the complexities are there, but he got the word to my father. You're on the list. And as he said, we then faced a choice. To be on a list meant prison, death. the children being given up for adoption or killed or what have you, or you stay. So on the night of August 1949, we paddled across the Danube to Slovakia, to Czechoslovakia at that point. Now, the reason we did that was geopolitical. The Cold War was raging already, and the Hungarian-Austrian border was completely sealed. There was no way to break through. On the other hand, you could get across the Austrian-Czech border. How? Well, the Germans, I should say, the Soviets looked at Israel as anti-British, and they figured that there was an outside chance they could bring them into a Soviet bloc. What did the Israelis need? They needed Jews and weapons. What did the Soviets have? More Jews than they knew what to do with, and lots of weapons. And so a rat line, as we used to call it, ran from Bratislava to the Italian ports in the Adriatic, where ships were waiting to take the Jews and the weapons to Israel. My father was a dedicated Zionist, absolutely believed in the state so long as he didn't have to go there. Because in this state, as he said, they handed you 2 hand grenades and sent you to the Negev. He was tired of being in a place that had to fight for his life. He wanted to be in a strong country. Camus said, neither a victim nor a victimizer be. My father's position is this was a deranged concept. There's only victims and victimizers, and it is much better to be a victimizer. He wanted to go to a big country. He liked the United States because it was bigger than all its neighbors. So if it went berserk, it would go berserk in another country. He was invited to go to Canada. The Canadians wanted all the immigrants they get. There were only 15 million people in Canada. There were 200 million in the United States. That's not good odds. He wanted to go to the big country to be safe. And it became very simple. And he got to the big country, but in a very complicated way that also has to do with the Cold War. Getting into the United States wasn't easy. We, my mother, my sister, and I came to the United States on a destroyer in the captain's cabin. My mother never understood that destroyer captains do not give up their cabins, nor do the refugees travel on them. We never were able to put it together, but we found a paper that showed that my mother was applying for citizenship 2 weeks after she'd arrived in the country, which actually takes a little longer to get American citizenship. And my father was reporting into a place called Hallein, just out of Salzburg, where the U.S. counterintelligence, I found out later, operated. The Cold War was boiling. The Americans did not know what was going on the other side of the hill. People like my father were being recruited to be on the other side of the hill. We don't know what he did. We have a picture of him on a boat, surrounded by thugs, wearing an armband. When I asked him about the armband, he explained to me, well, I was the translator. The weakness of this theory was that he couldn't speak English worth a damn 10 years later. So I don't know what he was translating. My parents lied to me with an efficiency born of history. Much of what happened I did not need to know. And to the extent that I found it, they would lie about it. But here he was, caught up in the geopolitics of the Cold War, in order to get his family into the United States. And this is the personal dimension of geopolitics that I wanted to talk about. When I said to my father, and I spent a great time in Europe studying at universities like Freiburg or in Paris University, why don't you come back to Europe? He said, I have no interest in any of them. They should all rot in hell. Words a little more stiff. I said, don't you understand that they've changed? I was 20 years old here. And he says, The Europeans, they never change. They just forget. And so the question of this book was a very personal one. Have the Europeans changed? Now we have to remember that Europe was not sovereign until 1992. Sovereignty is about war and peace. And the decision of war and peace did not rest in Rome, in Paris, in London. It was resting in Moscow and Washington. In the fundamental sense of what sovereignty means, they weren't sovereign. And for that period of time, because the Americans and the Russians were extremely careful in how they managed the situation, there was no war. During this time, the European Union was invented. And the inventor of the concept of the European Union was not Europeans. It was Americans, particularly George Marshall. Because in the Marshall Plan was an argument for European integration. And the Europeans opposed it intensely. The French did not want to be integrated with the Germans. The British did not want to be integrated with the French. As I like to say, nobody wanted to be integrated with the Italians. It was something opposed. Why did the Europeans adopt it? It was Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle realized that if he accepted this idea of integration, he could create an integrated Europe of which France would be the dominant country, Britain excluded, and he could recreate French power. It had nothing to do with peace and prosperity. It had everything to do with French power. In due course, it morphed. In 1992, finally, the mature European Union emerged. And the European Union that emerged in 1992, based on the Maastricht Treaty, emerged at a very special time, because it was the same year in which the Soviet Union collapsed. For 500 years, there was always a European global power, the Soviets being the last one. After 1992, for the first time, there was no European global power. First time in 500 years. There was only one global power, the United States. For the first, from 1992 to 2008, it went beautifully, but it was also the most prosperous period of history, hiding the basic contradictions that were underneath the surface, which were revealed in 2008. In 7 weeks in 2008, the underlying contradiction of Europe was revealed. First, on August 8th, 2008, the Russians invaded Georgia. This did two things. It announced with authority that Russia was back in the game, and also said to all the other countries, particularly Ukraine, Georgia is friends with the United States. This is what friendship with the United States gets you. Nothing. We were caught up in Iraq and Afghanistan. We didn't have the forces to intervene. This plays out in Iraq, is playing out at this moment, in Ukraine, is playing out at this moment. The other thing that happened 7 weeks later was the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. The United States managed it very well, the way the United States always manages it. The federal government bails out the banks condemn the federal government. It's a standard thing. We did it in third world debt crisis, we did it with Resolution Trust and the savings and loan crisis. This is the way we did. The Europeans had no such ability. They weathered their financial crisis and then wound up in the sovereign debt crisis, where countries couldn't pay back their debt. Why? The fundamental problem of Europe is that Germany exports in excess of 50% of its GDP. Imagine if the United States exported 50% of its GDP to Mexico and Canada. What would their conditions be? Well, it was the same situation. We must begin by remembering that the most vulnerable country in Europe is Germany. Its entire prosperity depends on its customers. And half of its customers are in the free trade zone of Europe. And if those can't buy, then Germany's social stability is at risk. And therefore, from 2009 to 2011, Deutsche Bank surged its lending throughout the zone to maintain it, which is why it couldn't pass its stress test. It still hasn't recovered from what the German government made it do. Now, there are two narratives of what happened here. One is that the Germans were fooled by the wily Greeks, or the other story is that the Germans deliberately primed the pump. I have known Deutsche Bank examiners, and they're not all that simple and trusting. So, whatever the story is, the story matters less than the fact. The question became, how do we pay back the sovereign debt? And why was this problem? Because Europe had been created in such a way as to make entrepreneurial activity impossible. Okay? The tax structure meant that if you made a great deal of money, they took it away from you. That overstates it, but not by too much. The rules on human resources meant that you didn't hire people, you adopted them. You couldn't shake loose by mere bankruptcy from the problem. And so there is no Google, there is no Facebook, there is no Microsoft challenging Siemens. And indeed, when they do come in, their antitrust regulations, put them in their place very quickly. Europe is filled not with entrepreneurial growth, but with 1950s-style corporations. It also meant that in countries in the South and West, everything was in the black market. So I have a friend who works in Romania, who creates bolts in Romania. And so I said to him, how many employees do you have? And he said, what do you mean employees? How many buildings do you own? Own is such a complex concept. He was a criminal. But he was sponsored by the Romanian government to be a criminal because with the Romanian government, the Greek government, the Italian government all understood that except for the black market, there could be no entrepreneurial activity, there would not be any employment, that the rules of Brussels, the pricing of the euro, and all these other things made it impossible for them to be on the books. As a result, not that my friend would have paid taxes anyway. I mean, that's not overstated. But he certainly wasn't going to pay taxes when he was a criminal. As a result, this created the sovereign debt crisis. The tax base was irrational. The tax base of Eastern and Southern Europe did not represent the realities. So they couldn't pay back with it. So the question became, who should take the burden? Should the debtor or the creditor take the burden? The Greeks said, I think it should be the creditor. The Germans said, nah, let it be the debtor. The Germans won. And this resulted in a social catastrophe in Southern Europe. 26% unemployment in Greece, 22% unemployment in Southern Italy, 24% unemployment in Spain, and unemployment for those under the age of 25 is 50 to 65%. And we are here not talking about poor people getting poorer. The people who became unemployed were the professional classes of Europe. Because when you're a government employee and laid off, it's not like here's the lady in the motor vehicle bureau you hate. That's good, she got laid off. You're talking about doctors. You're talking about electrical engineers. You are talking about a broad range of telecommunications people. These were the people who not only got laid off, but if they kept their jobs, their salaries were cut, as in the case of a friend of ours in Greece, from $3,000 a month to $800 a month. In Southern Europe, it is the middle class, the professional class, that has been devastated by the past 5 or 6 years. When the poor get poorer, well, at least they understand the grammar of poverty. It's not a new world. But when we get unemployed and we lose our house, the entire structure and expectations of our lives shift. At first, you believe this is only temporary. But after 7 years, it's hard to believe that it's only temporary. And it's not temporary, it is structural and it's long-term. But I also want to tell you these unemployment rates are the same rates that we had in the United States in the Great Depression. Okay? So the unemployment rate is staggering. Germany's unemployment rate, Austria's unemployment rate is 5%. Their unemployment rate is Great Depression level. You now have multiple Europes, so let's talk just three. We have Germany, a nation of enormous efficiency, as it says, totally desperate to maintain its exports, and suffering from the disease of all efficient exporters. Their customers can't buy or won't buy. We're very fortunate in the United States to be 9% export in goods. Of that, 40% goes to Canada and Mexico. We're exposed to the world only by about 5% of GDP. So you take a 20% hit, hey, it's pain. Germany is totally exposed. Yes, it is very efficient. You can cut your throat with efficiency. So Germany is doing everything it can to maintain the free trade zone. So what it will do is declare, we actually don't care if the Greeks leave, but we'll give you 4 more months. You will notice that the Germans always kick the can down the road. And the reason is not because, well, we're just feeling good about ourselves here. The reason is they can't afford the risk of the free trade zone collapsing, of protectionism and things of that sort. They can't absorb that. In the meantime, you have Southern Europe in depression. Depression at a level that even QE isn't going to solve. Eastern Europe obsessed with the Ukrainians, which the Spaniards really couldn't care less about. It ain't a major issue for them. And the Germans obsessed with maintaining exports. And the French bitching and moaning kind of on the margins about something. But in other words, they haven't found their place yet in this universe. This has nothing to do with the European Union we saw from 1992 to 2008. This is a completely different world. And what you see happening when the middle class becomes radicalized because of unemployment, what you get are left-wing, but particularly right-wing movements. And we see the National Front in France, we see Podemos in Spain, Five Star in Italy, Jobbik in Hungary. Europe is filled with right-wing and left-wing movements. And the main Europeanist parties are, to a large degree, being discredited. The question is, who takes them out? Not how far do they... We see nationalism rising. If you go to Europe now, you see something in hatred for Germany in much of Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. German contempt for everyone else. You see fragmentation of European countries. We saw 45% of Scots voting to leave the United Kingdom. People say, well, they didn't get the other 5%. I'm sitting here and saying 45%? We see Catalonia moving toward trying to leave Spain. We see the Belgians talking about dissolving Belgium. We see northern Italy talking about leaving southern Italy. This time I think they're serious. But we see all of these movements, the Hungarians in Romania wanting to leave Romania. We see these micro geopolitical events. And we already see war, but we always saw war in Europe. The Europeans fantasized that it was a peaceful continent. 100 million people died. 100,000 people died, I should say, in Yugoslavia. Last I looked, it was Europe. 40,000 people died in the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia in the Caucasus at the same time. It has never been a peaceful place. Will it go to war again? That's not clear. Is it an unstable place with an unstable political system? Well, how else could it be with this level of unemployment and this differentiation? It seems to me that we're looking at flashpoints coming alive everywhere. the flashpoint between Russia and the West is alive. We see, to me, the immigration problem in Europe of Islamic is really the Turkish problem, since many of them are Turkish, coming back alive, because Turkey is now the most dynamic country in Europe, and has been for quite a while. Its good fortune was it was kept out of the EU. It also has the largest army in Europe, 1 million people. So the Mediterranean is sparkling, and even the Danes are asking to close their borders so that Bulgarians can't get jobs and Islamists can't get in. When you paint the very short history of the EU, which I've tried to do, it begins to answer the question that I posed at the beginning. Is it over? And when you talk about geopolitics, you also have to talk about the people that we know in Romania or in Greece, and what this means to them and who they are, to understand the bitterness that's building and the anger that's building. Is it over? Well, certainly in the sense that Europe has found peace and prosperity, and European exceptionalism rules and soft power is all you need, that has become more and more problematic every day. The question is whether or not the Europeans are going to have another war. And for this, we have to look at the one that's happening. And where is it happening? Where you would expect it to happen. In the borderland between Russia and the European peninsula. Ukraine, in Belarus, in the Baltics. And if you visit Poland, the Baltics, you visit Romania, they are all working with the United States to create a containment policy, and it is coming back. Doesn't mean it has to be the 31 years. I don't think the Europeans have another 31 years in them, I hope. But it also doesn't mean that we have reached a point where we have abolished geopolitics in favor of economic growth. Or to be more precise, it would be fine if there were economic growth. But there isn't. And there are structural reasons why there isn't, is what I'm trying to point out. And so for the United States, now the only global power, the question that it has to ask is the same question as asked for the past 100 years. The one thing the United States has always responded to was a European hegemon who could take control of Germany and Russia and combine their capital and technology with Russian manpower and resources. We fought the First World War. Right after the Tsar fell, we intervened. We fought the Second World War about the relationship between Germany and Russia. The Cold War was entirely about the relationship between Germany and Russia. So this is what we always respond to. We respond to many things, including Haiti, Somalia. I mean, you know, what do you got this week? But this is the core American strategic issue since 1914. Can we tolerate a hegemonic power? Is Russia a hegemonic power? How do we prevent it from becoming a hegemonic power? And why can Russia play this game? Because Europe is so weak and fragmented, so much at odds with each other. Both the Russians and the Americans can pick off countries that they want one at a time. And so the old game continues. Let me ask questions. I went too long, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. We'll start with questions and answers immediately, so please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and speak loudly. Go ahead.
Thank you, LJ. Jay Johnston. I wonder if you could comment on the Duke March.
I will honestly say I haven't heard of it, which means it probably isn't working too well, but I'll check it out. No, well, we have to first address the fact that the debt that the Greeks, the Spaniards, much of the Italian debt, cannot be repaid. It's not a question of wanting to and not wanting to. It can't be. The Hungarians pioneered a method for handling this. Viktor Orban is the Prime Minister of Hungary. A lot of money was lent by Italian and Austrian banks in the 1990s for mortgages that were denominated not in Hungarian currency forint, but in euros, in Swiss francs, in yen, in zloty, anything you wanted. The forint collapsed after 2008. People couldn't repay it. Orban went to the banks and they said, basically, here's what we're going to do for you. We're going to repay you in forints, whatever it's denominated in forints. We're going to give you about 60 cents on a dollar. It's more complicated, but it comes out to about that. You have an alternative in which we give you nothing. Sleep on it, give me a call in the morning, let me know what you want. They bought it. We have to remember one of the strange things about the euro. It is subject to the debtor. In other words, if the debtor decides to default, the most efficient default is to print your own currency and announce that you're paying back in that currency, in a drachma. And the Hungarians have done that. One of the things we know about banks, I'm thinking of a clean way to say this. You're silly people. You'll take the money, you'll take what you can get, and then go into arbitration somewhere deep in the bowels of the world. The point is, the debtors have the euro in their pocket. They will decide whether it is better to continue trying to repay this way or to follow the Hungarian model. It's a complex issue, but ultimately, if American Airlines can decide to manage their debt structure, so to speak, so can countries, and they will, because many of these countries, the governments can't survive if they try to pay it back. Just the revolt is too great. So the answer on the euro, I don't see it surviving, but it's not going to be up to the Germans who want it to survive. It's not going to be up to the French. It's going to be up to the debtors whether or not they're going to redefine their loans in terms of currency they can control. And I think they will.
Julie?
Julia, so what about Spain? They had similar unemployment levels, but were they structurally both as Greece?
Well, it's interesting. One of the problems that Spain has, and all these countries have, is the degree of destruction that has been wreaked on the infrastructure of the businesses. In Spain, over 50% of construction firms have gone bankrupt. That means that if you try to stimulate the economy through construction, you first have to reconstruct the firms. It's a serious problem. The Spaniards have not been as, how should I put it, vocal. But the movements like Podemos, the Catalonian independence movement, okay, are actually more radical than the Greek. So there's a paradox in the way the public addresses the question, which is much more sober, and the political way which they express it, which is really, in many ways, more extreme. So yes, they have the same problem. Each nation addresses it differently. The one to watch next is not Spain, it's Ireland. Ireland has announced that it wants to renegotiate its debt. It's not in as bad condition as any of these countries, but they're looking at the Greeks, and they're saying, this is a pretty good deal for us. And when the Irish ambassador comes, you can ask her, as I'd like to, exactly what is the status of the renegotiation process?
Karen?
Why would the United States not have participated in the negotiations in Minsk?
Because the negotiations in Minsk are a joke. In other words, it's not going to get anywhere. The question on Minsk is whether or not the Russians have any benefit from this. Minsk doesn't address the fundamental question. Ukraine is of fundamental importance to Russia. This is where they crushed the Wehrmacht. You will say nobody wants to invade you. But remember what I said, in 1932, Germany didn't want to invade. By 1938, they could, 6 years. For them, a neutral Ukraine is fundamental. Their view is that the United States' has basically undermined a neutral Ukraine to create a pro-Western one. The only reason the United States would do this is to gain some sort of strategic advantage over the Russians. This, by the way, I think is true for what we did. And we had reasons for doing it that we don't have to go into now. The Russians absolutely have no confidence in the United States. The United States has no confidence in the Russians. Actually, nobody has any confidence in anybody else. But if you're going to have a Minsk talk and not have fistfights, leave the Russians and the Americans out. Because I'm sure the Germans and the French together can solve anything. Sometimes in diplomacy, you have negotiations that are created not because they're intended to solve the problem, but to give the illusion that something is happening. That's the Minsk talk. And for the United States, what they're doing is pre-positioning tanks and artillery in the Baltics, in Bulgaria, in Romania, and Poland. The United States is busy constructing an alliance structure outside the framework of NATO on a bilateral basis with the countries in the region who are happy to join in, and placing aircraft in position to attack an armored column. You really need aircraft these days. So the United States is shifting its focus. Remember about the pivot to Asia that never actually happened. This is a pivot to Europe, but a very peculiar Europe from an American point of view, where the Germans don't want us doing this, and we really don't care what the Germans want or don't want. But General Hodges, who is the commander of U.S. Army forces in Europe, went to Ukraine, announced that they were going to be sending trainers into Ukraine, and pinned medals for heroism on Ukrainian troops. Now that's a big move. So the answer is that the Minsk talks are for the newspapers, or as they say in Brazil, for the eyes of the English. And the real question is, can Putin survive?
We have time for 2 more questions. The young student there with the red, stand up, introduce yourself.
And this has obviously created this new anti-Semitism in Europe. Do you believe this could possibly turn into the second Holocaust?
No. First, anti-Semitism is not the crucial thing, although the Israelis will grab any occasion to raise money. The underlying thing is that, as happened in the 1970s and 80s, part of the Islamic movement in Europe is attacking Jewish facilities. There are also anti-Semites in Europe, but they are not a significant thing. The Islamic terrorism against all Europeans is more psychological than significant. I mean, it's scary to think you can go out one day and get killed. But then we saw the airline today. There are many things like that can happen. For the Europeans, far more important than the Islamic movement is the Bulgarian movement. That is, if you have an economic problem, you really don't want Bulgarians and Poles and everybody else taking jobs. And under the current rules of Europe, anybody can. And so there is a movement in many countries to control their borders of who can come in. And I think that is a much more significant problem. The Islamist problem is a deep psychological problem that the Europeans have to cope with. Anti-Semitism is primarily effective anti-Semitism from Muslims to Jews. And this has been going on for a long time in Europe, hitting Jewish targets. Now, can anti-Semitism rise? Yeah, but that's not the real issue. For Europe, it is the outsider. When I went to a museum in Trier, the city museum, it was very interesting to see that the section on Jews and Muslims in Trier were in the same part of the museum. So, from the point of view of the city of Trier, it was the same phenomenon. The outsiders coming in. And that feeling is there and is built into European culture. But Holocaust, no.
Thank you. Jens, the last question.
But where is the enemy now? And your last sentences about the Islamic threat is my question exactly. We have an ISIS. Do traditional negotiations work with them, or what is your vision for a strategy, and what is your risk coming from those countries which are not really countries?
Well, they never were countries. They were invented by the French and the British, and they were operated through dictators who held it together, Syria and Iraq. There are 1.2 billion Muslims. There is no military solution to this problem. There are various movements that arise, and they can only be contained by other movements. The model that has to be followed is Lebanon. It has to be remembered that in Lebanon from 1975 to 1990, there was a civil war. There were multiple Shiite groups, Hezbollah, Nabi Berri, and Amal Nisha. There were multiple Sunni groups, multiple Christian groups, and they fought each other. And eventually, none could destroy the other, and none could be destroyed. So eventually, after 15 years, they reached some sort of understanding. None could be imposed, and Ronald Reagan sent troops to Lebanon after the explosion that killed, I think, 280 Marines. He pulled all the troops out because he understood something fundamental. There are limits to military power, and the number of Marines it would take, soldiers it would take, to pacify Lebanon was one, probably beyond what we could raise, and two, it doesn't much matter, let them kill each other. I don't know that he said that, but I suspect he thought that. There are problems that cannot be solved, certainly not militarily, but there are problems that can be contained. And you see that process underway yesterday in Yemen, where the situation in Yemen had gotten completely out of control. It was necessary to have airstrikes, and the Americans said, hey, we'll give you targeting information. Go do it, guy. And so they put together a coalition of 10 countries. You really only needed the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And they carried out the airstrikes. One of the keys to power is to understand what you cannot do and understand what ultimately the outcome doesn't matter. So the ISIS has done everything it can to draw attention to itself as a monstrous thing. It's a monstrous thing. But it intends to be appearing as a monstrous thing to draw the United States in and other countries. To give in to your enemy by allowing him to decide your strategy is a militarily unacceptable thing. So my view is we have a huge problem in the Middle East, in the Islamic world. We do not have the power to solve it. They are not going to turn into Wisconsin Democrats, at some point. The mere desire to do something is the most dangerous thing for a great power. Something must be done is the only statement you should ever hear before you run. And I refer to Mr. John McCain. So my answer is I don't see a problem that rises to the level where the United States could effectively deploy military force and achieve an outcome. In Russia, that's a different story, and that's more to the point.
Dr. Friedman, thank you so much for coming to Charlotte. You just can't imagine how excited we were to hear the news that you were going to come to Charlotte. But I have to tell a quick story first before I present you with this. This morning, I was on my way back home from a breakfast meeting, and I stopped by the bank. And I was in the teller line, the outside teller line, and it was a double line, and I was waiting over on lane B while lane A got served. And I had the WFAE radio show on, pretty loud so I could hear. And I noticed the teller was taking a long time to get to me. And finally, after 5 minutes, she said, "What are you listening to?" And I said, well, WFAE is a Mike Collins show. It's Dr. George Friedman, and he's in town to speak to the World Affairs Council today at lunch. She said, "This is fascinating." She said, "I'm sorry it took so long to get to you, but I just couldn't stop listening." And well, she was about 20 years old, so I thought, well, I told her all about the Magellan Society and the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, so I hope we got a new member out of that, but I want to say thank you for that. And this is just a little certificate of appreciation for coming to Charlotte. And we hope that you will come next year again and make Charlotte a more familiar place.